It's a Saturday morning in 1978, and you've driven yourself down to your local Pontiac dealership. You're not just browsing, you've been saving for months. You walk through that showroom door, and right there, sitting under the fluorescent lights like it owns the room, is a brand new Firebird Trans Am. The screaming chicken stretched across the entire hood, the shaker scoop poking through like it's daring you to look away. And it is absolutely everything you wanted in a car. Then, the salesman hands you the price sheet. $6,000 as a starting point. And that's before you even glance at the options list. The WS6 Performance Package alone pushed you well past that. So for a massive portion of American buyers in 1978, that number was simply a wall. You walk back out into the parking lot, climb into whatever you drove there, something older, something with rust doing its slow creep around the wheel wells, and drive home wondering if a car like that is just never going to happen for you. But here's what most people have completely forgotten about 1978. Pontiac actually had an answer sitting right there in that same showroom. Something wearing a Pontiac badge, carrying a genuine V8 under the hood, priced over $1,000 less than a comparable Firebird or Trans Am. And if you stood across the parking lot and squinted hard enough, it gave off just enough of that Firebird silhouette to make your pulse jump for a second before your brain caught up with your eyes. That car was the Pontiac Sunbird. And for one very strange, very specific window of time, you could order it with a 305 cubic inch V8. The poor man's Trans Am. Almost entirely forgotten today. And the story of how it came to exist is just as interesting as the car itself. To understand why Pontiac did this, you have to look at what was happening to the American car industry in the years leading into 1978, because the landscape had shifted almost completely from what it had been a decade earlier. The muscle car era was effectively over. It didn't end with a bang. It died slowly under the combined weight of federal emissions regulations, safety standards, and the aftershock of the 1973 oil crisis that had permanently changed how Americans thought about gasoline. The manufacturers that had built their reputations on horsepower were now stuck figuring out how to keep customers excited about cars that were increasingly being strangled by regulation. The famous pony cars took the hardest hits. The Mustang got rebuilt almost from scratch to fit a smaller, lighter architecture and became the Mustang II. The Camaro and Firebird survived, but were running significantly tamer engines than just a few years prior. The buying public was still there, still passionate, but being pushed hard towards smaller, cheaper vehicles out of pure financial necessity. What was selling was the subcompact segment. The Ford Pinto was everywhere. The AMC Gremlin was moving steadily. Even the Chevy Vega, despite its reputation problems, was doing numbers. People needed affordable transportation, and the smaller cars fit that bill even when they weren't exciting. General Motors, though, was carrying a specific problem the other manufacturers weren't. The Chevy Vega had been one of their big bets in the subcompact market. It looked good on paper and wasn't bad looking from the outside either, but it turned into a disaster in practice. The Vega's aluminum inline 4 developed a catastrophic reputation: overheating, warping cylinder walls, oil burning, premature engine failures in cars that were barely a few years old. And the rust problems were severe enough that Vega jokes became their own subculture among car people. The damage that did to GM's credibility with the American consumer was real and lasting. They needed to prove across as many different cars and engine combinations as possible that they could build reliable vehicles for ordinary people. More engine options in more models was one path forward. Show the public that not every engine bolted to a GM product was going to self-destruct before the warranty ran out. That mindset is part of what set the stage for the Pontiac Sunbird to exist at all. The Sunbird had come onto the market as a successor to the Chevy Monza platform, sharing its lineage with the same Vega architecture that had caused GM so much grief. It launched with a range of 4- and 6-cylinder options that were perfectly adequate and absolutely nothing more than that. In 1976 and 1977, the Sunbird sold around 50,000 units per year, respectable for Pontiac in the economy space, but not exactly lighting the industry on fire. By 1978, the Sunbird came in hatchback, coupe, and wagon form. The Sport Coupe had picked up some styling cues from the 1977 and 1978 Firebird that, from the right angle and the right lighting, created a silhouette that rhymed with the Firebird without copying it directly. The front end had enough of that fastback suggestion, enough forward lean, that you could see what they were going for. It wasn't a bad-looking car. But it wasn't setting hearts on fire in showrooms either. So Pontiac made a decision that on the surface sounds almost too simple. They dropped the 305 cubic inch small block V8 from the Chevy parts bin directly into the Sunbird's engine bay. A genuine V8 in a small economy car for a price tag that undercut the Firebird by over $1,000. First exciting engine option the Sunbird had ever been offered with. And in concept, on paper, it made a certain kind of beautiful sense. The 305 made 145 horsepower and 245 pound-feet of torque in the Sunbird. Those numbers weren't going to intimidate anyone pulling up next to a real Trans Am. The Firebird that same year could be had with a 350 or 400 cubic inch engine operating in a completely different universe. But compared to what the Sunbird had been offering, particularly the 110 horsepower Buick V6 that was the previous top option, this was a genuine and noticeable upgrade. It had the sound, it had the pull. That particular low-end V8 rumble that no 4- or 6-cylinder has ever convincingly replicated, regardless of how much engineering gets thrown at the problem. 0 to 60 took around 10 seconds. The quarter mile came in somewhere in the 17-second range. Not numbers that were going to make the drag racing crowd take notice. But on a public road, in a car that cost meaningfully less than a Firebird, the experience was genuinely different from what the base Sunbird delivered. It felt alive in a way the economy versions simply didn't. Now here's where you should hit that subscribe button, and I mean this sincerely. If you're this far into a video about a car that barely 1,000 people ever bought, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. The forgotten ones, the weird ones, the cars that made sense on paper and then went sideways in execution. That's what we dig into here every single time. So get subscribed now before you forget, because the next one is already in the works and it's just as obscure as this one. Buyers could pair the V8 with either a 4-speed manual or a 3-speed automatic, both solid proven units. Pontiac also upgraded the front suspension for 1978, and the V8 Sunbirds received a torque arm rear suspension geometry, meant to improve handling over the older Vega-derived setup they were trying. Credit where it's due. For buyers who wanted to fully commit to the fantasy, Pontiac offered a formula trim package that dressed the Sunbird up in a way that made the Trans Am comparison easier to sell yourself on. Blacked out lower body panels, formula lettering down the sides, accent stripes, and a rear spoiler, which was the piece that really mattered. Because with that spoiler on the back, you genuinely had to look twice across a parking lot to confirm you weren't looking at something far more expensive. But the problems were significant. And they weren't minor inconveniences. They were the kind of fundamental issues that make you question whether this idea should have made it past the engineering whiteboard. The weight balance was the first thing. The Sunbird was a small, lightweight economy car by design. Stuff a heavy V8 up front, and the nose becomes disproportionately heavy in a way the rest of the car wasn't built to handle. Under hard cornering, the front end would push wide, understeer, which is not a flattering trait for a car borrowing its image from the Firebird. The 2:73 rear axle ratio didn't help either, tuned more toward fuel economy than performance, blunting whatever punch the 305 was putting down. Swap those gears for 3.73s, and the car reportedly transformed. But that's not what you got from the factory. Then there was the spark plug situation. The rear pair of plugs, buried between the engine and the firewall, with virtually no clearance, was so inaccessible that GM's own service documentation recommended mechanics drop the engine down an inch or two just to reach them for routine replacement. Drop the engine. For spark plugs, routine maintenance on the affordable option required lifting the engine out of position first. Once you optioned up a V8 Sunbird with the formula package to make it look the part, the price had climbed into the mid-$4,000 range. Still less than a base Firebird, but the gap had narrowed enough that some buyers were probably staring at both numbers and doing a different calculation than Pontiac had hoped they would. Pontiac offered the V8 Sunbird for $1978 and $1979. The Sunbird itself continued through 1980 as a 4- and 6-cylinder car. The obvious question is why the V8 disappeared a year before the model was discontinued entirely. The answer is straightforward and grim. It sold so badly that Pontiac was almost certainly losing money on every unit built. Total V8 Sunbird production across both model years is estimated at fewer than 1,000 cars. Fewer than 1,000. Across 2 full model years, the car existed in a difficult no man's land. Buyers who genuinely needed an affordable economy car didn't want the fuel economy penalty the V8 carried, and gas prices in 1978 and 1979 were not an abstraction. They were a daily financial reality. Buyers who wanted a V8 Pontiac with real performance could stretch to an actual Firebird, or look at what a fully optioned V8 Sunbird actually cost after the formula package, and realize the gap wasn't what they thought going in. The cars that did sell were driven hard and maintained poorly, because the people buying them were doing so precisely because they couldn't afford more expensive options. A lightweight economy car with a V8 shoved up front, a maintenance nightmare for spark plugs, and an owner base that was budget constrained, the survival rate was always going to be low. Today, V8 Sunbirds that surface for sale tend to move for under $10,000, making them genuinely accessible collector cars. Most people who see one have absolutely no idea what they're looking at, which honestly is part of the appeal. The V8 Sunbird exists entirely in the shadow of the cars it was trying to borrow credibility from. The 1978 through 1981 Trans Ams were producing some of the most iconic sheet metal of that whole era. The Sunbird couldn't compete with any of that in image or actual performance. What it offered was a way into that world for people who couldn't afford full admission. Less than 1,000 ever left the factory. A fraction of those are still around. Strange little artifacts of a moment when everyone was scrambling to figure out what performance even meant in a world where the old rules no longer applied. If you've come across one of these in the wild, or knew someone who had one back in the day, drop that in the comments. And if this is the kind of forgotten automotive history you want more of, make sure you're subscribed. The only way you catch the next one is if you already are.